Good morning. So evidently for you to hear me, I need to stand up here, but for me to see you, it'd be great if everyone was up closer, if that's possible. If you can move forward, except if you're quilting in the back, that's fine. You can chill there. And my wife never comes this close to me when I'm speaking in churches, so she's going to stay back there. It's good to be with you all. It's a long ride. I was trying to figure out when the last time I was at Hopedale. I think I preached here. It was sometime, all I know is between 2015 and 2018. Because during that season, I had left Metamora. I was conference minister at Illinois Mennonite Conference, and I lived in Morton. And I remember coming here and preaching in that season. I think you might have been in even a search process when Steve Slagle, or at least an interim ministry kind of process when Steve was here. And so it's been a while. It's hard to believe how time flies. So just introduce myself, if it's okay to jump right in. My name is Michael Danner. I was a pastor at Metamora Mennonite Church for about 18 years, from like late 1997 until 2015, in that range. And then after that time, from 2015 to 2018, I served as a conference minister for Illinois Mennonite Conference. And then in 2018, I was called to serve as the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality for Mennonite Church USA. My whole life, from the time I was 4 until then, I was in Central Illinois. My wife and I met at the University of Illinois. I grew up at Metamora, did all my schooling there, Metamora High School. Lived in Metamora, pastored in Metamora, lived in Morton a little bit. So this feels very much like home. One of the first things is my wife and I are coming, it's like, oh, they got the crops in. Like, I was looking at the harvest, see how things looked, because it's a little different in northern Indiana. In 2018, when I got the job with Mennonite Church USA, my wife and I moved to Elkhart, Indiana, where we've been living ever since then. So, and I've been serving in the same role with Mennonite Church USA. So I'm Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality is what my job is. And so if you think about Mennonite Church USA, there's an executive director who's Glenn Guyton. He's from San Antonio, Texas. He's been leading since 2018. And then there's 2 associate executive directors. There's Iris DeLeon Hartshorn, and then there's me. And so Iris deals with operations, HR, hiring, firing, and then all the racial ethnic engagements, racial ethnic groups, those kinds of things. So she's operations that side. I'd work on basically like the conference and congregation facing side of Mennonite Church USA. So I lead a team of, at this point, about 8 people that works with everything from if you use pastor salary guidelines, if you use MCUSA resources for search processes, if you use the Corinthian plan, any of these kinds of things, conference minister supports, anything related to churches and helping churches thrive and function is part of what our team does. So if you hire a new pastor, they do the MLI process. That's what our team does. And so always working at those systems and working with those folks in churches. So when Jessica asked about doing a Sunday school class, I said, yeah, I'd be glad to. I threw out a suggestion on missional decision-making processes. That comes out of the work that I do. As I walked up here, I was thinking, I wonder how many of you are all in church leadership or making decisions about church functions, church programming, all those kinds of things. So I was curious about that since I don't know. And then I began to wonder if this was going to be relevant at all. So that's a speaker anxiety, right? The other thing I wondered is if you, as a community, have any particular questions about Mennonite Church USA that you might want to ask or have me respond to. And so those are the 2 kinds of things that I'm sitting with right now. I mean, here's what I suggest. I'm going to roll through this missional decision-making process, but I'm going to leave enough time where, we have a good amount of time if you do have questions about Mennonite Church USA. Conference leadership would be more for their questions. But if you have questions about what's happening and where we're headed and things that are happening in MCUSA, that'd be great. Does that sound okay? Can we make this? Yeah. Well, you can say no. It's like, that doesn't sound That doesn't sound good at all. Okay, so let's just jump into this. You should have this sheet, and here's the thing, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later. Is that for the most part, what churches did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the kinds of things we did in community life together, the patterns of programming, Sunday school, Wednesday night service, all of those kinds of things that we think of as church, probably stopped being effective somewhere in the mid-90s into the 2000s. And a lot of people would notice that and say, look, there's not as many people coming to Sunday school post-COVID, a lot of people not coming back to churches in the same way. And there's all kinds of this awareness that we need to be doing things different. We need to be changing the way we do things. And yet, a lot of times we don't know what to do, right? We don't have any maps for the world we're in now. But one of the things that happens, maybe you've done this, you hire an expert or you talk to a consultant or you send your pastors to like a conference and they come back and they have all these great ideas. You've ever had that experience? They come back and it's like, man, I just learned this new thing. Now we're going to do natural church development. Now we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to do all this stuff. And the ideas are actually probably pretty good, except it seems like, at least in my experience, that by the time about 3 to 6 months goes by, you're basically just doing the same thing again, and it never really changes. I see a lot of smiles and a lot of nodding heads, right? Has that been your experience? So it's one thing to know you need to change, and even to have good ideas about potentially what might work a little bit differently, but it always seems to come back to the same thing. And the thing that I've noticed as a leader, as a local church pastor, but also as a leader in broader context, is that the one thing that never changes is actually the way that churches make decisions about what they'll actually do, right? So let's say I go away to a youth ministry conference and I come back and I say, okay, this is a great idea, we should try this. Okay, what are we going to do next? Well, we're a lay-led church, so we're going to talk to the nurture commission, is what it was, the discipleship team, or whoever has oversight of that. Well, the people sitting there, how did they learn to do what they're doing? Well, from the people that did it before them and said, here's the job and this is what you do. And where did they learn it? Well, from the people that came before them, and this is how you do what you do. And so eventually, all the people sitting there in that room making the decisions about what to do are experts, all right? But they're experts at what we've done. And that's what they know and that's what they understand. And so oftentimes in the decision making about what we do is constrained by that, right? It's like, okay, well, we know certain things are non-negotiables. You're going to have, of course you have Sunday school. Of course you need to have a youth group. Of course it needs to meet on Wednesday night. Of course you need to play games. And one of the things that I've noticed, I don't know if it's discouraging or not, but one of the things I've noticed that in 2025, when I talk to young youth leaders and like youth pastors in the church, and they describe what they're doing in youth ministry, I'm like, that sounds like what I was taught to do in 1985, 1986, and really there's very little difference in the way that they're engaging people, right? And so if the challenge is like if the status quo isn't getting the job done, but that's all we know how to do, it becomes very, very difficult, right, to exact change. So does that make sense? Church, right to the Casey's, because every small town has one, and I need to drink because my mouth is dry. So, how do you break that cycle? Right? How do you arm that cycle? So this idea is one that I got working with other churches, other church leaders, a man named Alan Roxborough, and some others. About how really the most important thing you have to do in a church if you want to have different outcomes is disrupt the way that you make decisions, period. And so you have to have a different way of going about it. And this is a very simple, what I would call a missional decision-making process. And so with the word missional, how many of you love that word? Anybody hate it? Like it was a huge term when integration happened back in 2000, 2002, and Mennonite Mission Network and MCUSA, every church missional, and it was a word that was thrown around a lot. I think within, probably at least by the mid-2000s, people were like, that's a stupid word. We don't want to hear it again. We don't like that word. Doesn't mean anything. And what kind of happened was everybody took that word, and what most of the Mennonite churches did is like, oh, we just relabel everything we do as missional. We just tack that on. But really, the word comes actually from a really good place and a really particular understanding of what God is doing in the world, right? And so normally, or even within a lot of church contexts before that, the assumption was that God would work inside the church, and then the church would take the message of the gospel to the community, right? So God worked in the church, and then the church went into the world. What missional theology actually claims is that, no, actually God is at work in the world already. And the church is a gathering of people that have given their lives to Jesus and have gathered together in community. But God is not just in here, he's also out there. God is at work in the world. And so God is the primary agent, right? He's the primary mover in what happens in terms of positive ministry and mission and things of that nature. And our job is actually to join God in that space, to certainly cultivate a rich life together as a community that's of mutual support, but also we engage the world around us, outside of us, and we meet God in that space as God is drawing people to himself through Jesus. Does that make sense? And so the agency, or like who's doing the work, shifts from the church doing the work to actually, no, this is God's work. The shorthand we would use in this is that God doesn't have a church in need of a mission. God has a mission in need of a church, right? And so God has a mission. It's the Missio Dei is what we would call it. God has God is at work, and God has a mission, and how do we join that is the primary question. So that runs headlong into traditions based on we're the primary agents, and we decide what we're going to do and how to do it and best to do it based upon all the things we've known, right? So how do you get out of that position into this other space? This is a four-step kind of process that I would suggest you actually integrate into your church. And so the first practice is listening, right? And so and it's deep listening to every aspect of one's ministry context. And so I'll just read through this. Listening is the practice of taking in information about every aspect of one's ministry context through formal and informal means, right? Sounds technical, but this is like an ongoing practice, but it can also focus on a specific time frame related to a particular project. But the basic idea is that you want to begin to think through the whole of your lives. Where do you interact with people? Who do you know? Who are your neighbors? What's the person? I know what the scene is like in your local Casey's on a Sunday morning, just for the 5 minutes. It's remarkably similar to every other Casey's I've been in. But what are the small time patterns? What's going on at the local high school? What's going on with healthcare? I know you have a health center here in a hospital, in a nursing home. Like, what's happening in all of these spaces? And as you begin to engage people around you, both inside and outside the church, you need to ask a question. Where do you see God at work? Where do you see signs of maybe this fruit of the Spirit or good work happening? But more than that, what do you hear people talking about? What are their concerns? What are their pressures? What are their challenges? Is it now, after a number of years of high inflation, are the economics, really hard? Do we have a lot of single parents in the community that can't make ends meet? Do you have people that have lost their jobs because of the shifts in the marketplace? So just deep listening to what is happening, right? This is always the first step. Like, people that I work with get annoyed with me. I'll just own that. Because the one question within 20 minutes of any meeting I'm in, I'll be asking one question within 20 minutes, and that is, what problem are we trying to solve? Every time you get a group of people together, they start talking about things, and I just wonder, like, what is it, what problem are we actually trying to solve, right? So when you think about missional engagement, engaging your world, trying to see what God is doing in a community like Hopedale, it starts actually with listening and trying to discern what problem, what challenges are we being called to address? Where is God at work? Where could we join in with what God is doing? And so you always start there. A lot of times in churches, when we're trying to decide what to do, the beginning point is anxiety or fear, right? Especially now. It's like, yeah, we don't quite know what we're doing. We're afraid that if our church gets any smaller, it might die. And we need to do something, but we don't know what it is. But often it comes with this anxiety. We need to do something quick. We need to try to stem the tide. And then I know when I was pastor at Metamora, when I started, we had gone through evangelism explosion. Anybody remember that? Then there was living in faithful evangelism, that life process. And then there was natural church development, and it was fear about dying, followed by one program that we tried, it didn't work. The next program, next up, by the time when that one doesn't work, they just bring in the next one, right? And I became pastor midway through the next one, and people were just fatigued. And I knew really quickly if I stepped into that space and said, well, here's the next one I've discovered, and it's going to actually work, that everyone would be like, this guy needs to go. I would maybe even, for Mennonites, pitchforks is probably out of the question, but there would have been like, no, we can't do this again. And so what I did was just took the foot off the gas of the church and said, why don't we just sit for a while? And why don't we just start to get to know our neighbors a little bit better and think more clearly and listen to what they're saying. And so the keys of this phase is one is just patience, right? You have to short circuit that anxiety that leads to action, which leads to bad results, which fuels anxiety. It's what called the doom loop if you're in business, and if you read Good to Great and some of those things, but it's called a doom loop, where you act without knowledge, and then you get disappointing results, and then you kind of turn on yourself and go, we don't know what we're doing again, but we got to do something, and so we do some action without knowledge, and it just keeps going. You need to interrupt that, and so it takes a lot of patience, right? You got to start with, we're just going to try to dampen the anxiety, and we're going to trust God in the midst of this, that God is the one doing the work, right? So patience, deep listening. So it's not just superficial, it's not surveys, it's actually being involved in people's lives and paying attention to what it is that they're saying and having your ear to the ground in the community, in the neighborhood, and even the broader culture, what's happening around us, what are the forces shaping the church. And then this also intentional listening to marginalized voices, like who in our community is on the margins, who's really struggling, who doesn't really have a voice or much power to make things different. How can we learn and understand what they're doing, right? So this is this first stage, this listening. And then the second one then is explore. And the explore step is, and these are linear but more circular. So you start with listening, and then you enter this exploring phase. And this is the practice of generating a thorough understanding of the resources and relationships a church community or nonprofit or organization can bring to bear in response to what you've heard in your listening. So you're listening, and you get this idea, these are the things that are going on, and then you start to explore within your midst, who's here, what resources do we have? They can be time, talent, treasure, the big three, but what are the resources that we have, and how can we bring those resources to bear on the thing we're seeing around us, or the thing we see God doing, or the need that's present in the community? And so you're exploring that. And the big things here are creativity, like you have to try to get outside of that's not the way we've done it before, right? Realize you're gonna start there, but try to put those things off as soon as possible and try to generate as many ideas and kind of deep listening as you think. It's more than, the resources are more than the church budget. It's the resources of the community that we all possess in various different ways. And so you've emphasized creativity, openness to ideas. Like it is really discouraging. I work with a lot of pastors that get hired to turn around churches, right? And they get hired to bring change, because we need forward-thinking vision, because we need to reach our neighbors with the good news, and we need to thrive as a church. And then immediately when they get hired, they come up with a few ideas that they've actually vetted even in the application process or even in the interview process, and they start to work at it to realize that the church itself, the system of the church, begins to shut them down at every turn. Every time they start to do the thing they've been hired to do, every time they start to bring change or anything that might be perceived as disruptive from different parts of the church, they put obstacles and roadblocks up in the way. And about a year or a year and a half later, they're very frustrated. They're questioning whether this was a good fit, whether they can even remain, because the thing they've been called to do and told they were called to do is not the thing they're being allowed to do or given permission to do. So this is really, really important, this openness, creativity, openness, and trust. So when you have people in your congregation, there's nobody, I've never seen any church leader, any pastor that says, I want to advance an idea that's going to hurt the church. Like, the thing I want to do is really going to be guaranteed to blow up the church. And, no, like, leaders bring things forward, folks bring new ideas forward because they care about the church and they want it to thrive, right? So how do you create openness and then trust that people are people of goodwill, people are part of the church that are coming up with different ideas, actually care about the church and want the church to thrive. So you create this openness and trust through this exploring. Like what are the options? What are the resources? How do we apply them to what we've heard? The third step then is probably the most important, and that is experiment. So this is practice of just engaging in particular intentional actions in an attempt to address the discerned needs through the resources and relationships of the church, right? So you've heard, you've figured out the resources, and now it's like, how do we bring these together in something that's actionable? And that would be the experiment phase. Really, really, really important that you approach this as an experiment. Like, we're going to try something, and it might work, but it may not work. And if it doesn't work, we're going to try something else. So this idea of experimenting and iteration is really, really important. Because what often happens in churches, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but in the churches I've been with, and it might not be true of you, but what they often do is they say, well, we need to discern together God's will for this ministry. And we're going to listen to the Spirit, and we're going to do this thing. And then they say, okay, we're going to do this thing because we feel the Spirit's leading us into this space. And then when they get into it and it doesn't work, they've painted themselves into a corner, because if this was what we heard God saying and this was the Spirit leading into this place, and this has to be a good place. But what if it's not? What if it's not actually doing the thing you want it to do? That's another kind of way to kind of paint yourself into a corner. It may be what God has called you to do, and it may not be. It may be what you thought was the best idea. And sometimes, every once in a while, people will use spiritual language to get an idea forward that's not exactly the thing, right? So experiment is really, really important. Like, we're gonna try this, right? We're gonna try this thing, and we're gonna do it with humility, right? We think this is the best way to go, but we don't know for sure. But we're gonna try it. We use the phrase bias. We have a bias towards action. In other words, doing something is often better than doing nothing. And a lot of times in church circles, the system is more prone to doing nothing if that something is new. Let's keep doing the thing we've done. And it's also got to be a team approach. It can't be seen as this is one person's experiment. We'll let Mike do his thing over there for a while, and we'll see if it works. Now we have to all be on board and kind of jump right in. The fourth then practice in this, it would be to evaluate, right? So you've listened, you've explored resources, you've come up with an experiment, you've lived with it for a while, and after a period of time, you have to evaluate. And the big question is, what did we learn through doing it? That would be one sentence. Like, what have we learned as a result of the experience? In light of what we learned, we will blank, right? We'll either never do this again, or we'll keep doing it the way we did because it's been really life-giving, or we'll continue to do it, but we need to tweak a few things to make it a little bit better, a little bit more effective. And so you do this evaluation, right? Courage, trust are still present here, but also truth-telling is really, really important in the evaluation stage. So you have to tell the truth, like, because there's so many pressures to think we did it right and we did a good thing, and then we say, oh well, the culture just isn't receptive to the gospel. Nope, we already said God's out there drawing people to Himself. So how do we work at this? The truth-telling is just being very just straightforward, non-judgmental. You're not blaming people. You're not saying, well, that nurture commission just had a dumb idea, so we're not going to do that again. No, it's like, did it work? Did it not work? What did we see? What did we experience? Can we do this again? Yeah. So does that make sense? Then there's those four, and then really the next one is to decide kind of what to do next. But you kind of keep doing this, and the way this can actually help kind of transform a church's structures if it becomes a part of like the seasonal pattern of how you do things, right? So I don't know about you, but most churches work in quarters, right? You have first quarter, second quarter, third quarter. It's usually tied to Sunday school. Like, you guys do that here? Like, and so it makes a lot of sense that you can track this on. Most also leadership teams will turn over in the summer months, and so you can do active listening, for instance, in the summer, or even in the spring, with an exploration kind of moving into summer as you decide what you're going to be doing in action in the fall. You can do the first 2 steps in the midst of that. Your experiment kicks off in the fall when your ministry cycle starts over again. By the 3rd quarter, you're going to want to start evaluating how it's going in preparation for, again, deep listening, exploration, and experimentation. So you can actually just get into a pattern of doing this as a church. And if you do that, you'll actually, what you end up doing is shifting the focus of the church from what do we think we need to do for us to what does it mean for us to engage the community? How do we engage the community? That's why it's a missional decision-making process. This will turn your focus outward to the people around you that you're being called to reach as a congregation. So again, the things at the bottom of the process can be applied to nearly any decision-making or generative process in the church, nonprofit, for-profits. Here's some my tips for effectiveness. I will say that, so at Metamora we did this, and the way we did it, the most clear wasn't like through the meta cycle, but the first time we tried it was with our mission commission, right? And so my dad is here. He was actually the chair of that commission at the time. And what we decided is, man, we've been just doing the same things over and over and over again. Each team was like, well, what we're doing is just what they did and what they did. And we started to ask questions about what it meant to be engaged with our community. So Mennonite Mission Network was using the phrase like across the street and around the world. What did it mean for us to be engaged in mission across the street in our neighborhoods more fully? How do we move out from being a kind of an inward-focused Mennonite community to an outward-focused community base? And so we started by putting all the ministries up on a board. We wrote them all out, and then in a very maybe melodramatic moment, we just erased all that and said, we're starting from scratch. Let's pretend we're not going to do anything. We've done nothing before. Based on who we are, how we understand ourselves, let's just engage in active listening. And so we started just doing deep listening in the community. One of the things that we learned as we did that was that the Baptist church in Metamora had run the food pantry for 20 years, but they had shrunk to the size that they didn't have any more resources at all, and they couldn't run it, and they were getting ready to close. And so we were like, well, as we wait to discern, as we discern and listen, why don't we just start helping them? So we began by helping them, and then about a year later, maybe they were like, yeah, we're done. And these are Southern Baptists. So Southern Baptists and Mennonites don't normally work together, but they said, you guys are doing such a good job. What we'd like to do is give you the building and the facility so that you can keep this going, right? And so they sold us the building for $1, I think is what it ended up being. That was what year, 2012? I'm looking at my dad. He doesn't know. It was a long time ago. The last time I was in Metamora, my mom and I went up and got like 7 dozen eggs at the local grocery store, which they do twice a week. And we went to the same pantry that's now running and bigger and thriving. They're adding on to it. And it's probably the most significant food sharing ministry in Woodford County at this point. So that came from just like, we'd never done that before. We're just trying to listen and figure out what was happening. We discerned a need that we'd heard about. We started to pitch in and help with it. And then through that relationship, it grew. And then eventually, we explored, can we do this long term? So we had those whole stages as a church had to come together and say, is this something we're going to do? And we decided to launch an experiment. Yeah, let's try this for like a 2-year period and see how this works. And at the end of that period, then evaluating how's it going, and said, yeah, this is something that's life-giving. The relationships we're building there, the folks that we were engaging there, it's really, really important work that's happening. And so they continued to do that, experiment, evaluate, and run into this process. So that's one example of how this kind of process can work, like starting from scratch to believe. But so a few things about this, though. It's tempting to jump right into the experiment phase. Like if there's any common mistake that people use in this, it's they skip the listening and they skip the exploring. They just go, let's do something. And Mennonites were geared that way anyway. Let's do something. Well, if you do something, but you don't know, if you haven't done deep listening, you haven't understood the needs, you haven't thought through what the resources are you bring to bear, you can do all kinds of damage in that experiment stage. You can actually try to solve a problem that isn't present in the community. You can try to engage in a place where there's not kind of fertile ground already there. Or you could bite off more than you can chew, taking on a big project, but realizing in the midst of it that you don't have the resources to follow through. Another thing that we did at Metamora was engage in a relationship with Caribbean in the Caribbean coast region of Colombia with 7 church plants. And as we were going through these listening and exploring phases, somebody from Midnight Mission Network, Linda Shelley, said, "Here's the thing: like, there's 2 different options that you can follow. You can relate to this already existing ministry that's in Ecuador, I think, and it would be great. You can go down there, you can give them resources; they'll be appreciative. And then if you decide a couple years down the line you don't want to do it again, you step out and they'll be fine." It's like, oh, okay, that seems a little bit rich. They said, if you want to get engaged with the Caribbean, the churches in the Caribbean coast region, you better make sure you have the resources. This is considered the cost of building a tower kind of thing. Because if you get into this with them and then you decide you cannot do the things you've committed to, it will be devastating to them. Like, this is literally like they will feel hung out to dry by American churches and false promises and things like that. And so we really had to face like this explore stage of, okay, we love the idea, we see the need. Can we really do this thing? Can we really do it? And that, again, that was 2010. This past week, John Byler, if you know John Byler, Gail Newman, if you know folks from that church, they were at our offices in Elkhart with a contingent of 8 Colombian church leaders and families that were still a result of that relationship that started 15 years ago. So when you think through this, when you listen carefully, you discern where you could really be helpful. When you explore your resources and come up with an experiment, when you do those steps, it can actually lead to lifelong kind of engaged mission and ministry. So don't jump right into experiment phase. Spend as much time with each one. Hold experiments loosely. If you see it isn't working, stop, pause, evaluate those things. Evaluate ideas and actions, not people and motivations. Like, those are really, really important tips for effectiveness, right? Questions about that? I know I said a lot. I'm accused of talking too fast. Any questions about any of this? Like, I'm all glad to talk with leaders and different folks around. If you think, let's give this a whirl, or to explain things a little bit more. But that's just an overview of a different way to kind of maybe go about how we would make churches different. And the hardest part is that shifting from an inward focus to an outward focus that actually locates the action and the needs of the people and what God's doing in the community. So yeah, unless there's more questions there, does anyone have any questions? Oh, yeah, Kurt.
In the Gospels and Acts, I think that those kinds of patterns, that process kind of happens organically.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, anyone else's thoughts? Michael, your thoughts? Where do you see that happening? I have a couple of examples, but I'm interested in hearing them.
Anyone see this pattern like in the Gospels? I mean, I do, of course, but
yeah, I would affirm that one too. The thing that Rita and I were talking about just the other morning, a very well-meaning TV preacher gave a call to ask for forgiveness of sins and follow Christ. And I'm not putting that down, but the emphasis was on eternity. But to a person who doesn't understand what a sin is nor what eternity is, what good do those words do? And so the partner to that seems to be the duality of being in our communities and in our world, in the humdrum of the everyday, so people understand a little bit of what that prayer means. And again, I don't want to put that person down for his efforts, but on the other hand, we have been so focused, I think, on this eternal idea when Jesus says, I'm here for the here and now to show you a better way of living. And then these things transform your lives into understanding this concept of how God is at work everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's up to us to plug in. And being in business, the most effective thing I learned was no decision is worse than a wrong decision. So if you make no decision on a matter, that's one thing. But if you make a wrong decision, the reason you know it's wrong is because you figured out it was wrong and you make adjustments. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. It's part of growth and living together. So yeah, I think this whole idea of moving out of the building into the community and into our own worlds. And this community here, we are very worldly. We go into lots of places around the U.S. and in the world, and we're actively doing that. So how do we plug in there? So, you know, but if we don't talk about it, we don't know. Mm-hmm.
I was the one who brought up the subject the other morning, listening to this TV preacher who's very, very good. But I didn't grow up Mennonite. I grew up, I don't know, part Lutheran, part Presbyterian, part Church of God. Lots of different in my lineage, I guess you'd say. But I finally looked at Randy and I said, well, if people weren't brought up in a Christian home, maybe they don't think they're sinning. So how do we deal with that? Mm-hmm. You know? And there's a lot of things we can do in this community, in this U.S., without going so far away. I mean, we can do that too, I guess, mm-hmm. But mm-hmm. I don't know. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. It sparked a lot of different thoughts in my head. I think some of them got away from me. But yeah, so I wasn't grown up. I grew up in Metamora, but I didn't grow up Mennonite. So I grew up in a different tradition and became Mennonite. Really well, my mom and dad, the church I grew up in split. Mom and dad started going to the Mennonite church. So that was my first exposure to Mennonites was when I was in college. I would come home and play on the church softball team. And they let me play because I was fast. I couldn't hit the ball, and they put me out in, was it right field, off where nobody hits it. That's where I played on defense. But if I made any contact with the softball, I could get to first. And as a matter of fact, the last game I ever played of softball was with the Mennonite church, running to first and pulled a hamstring, and that was that. But anyway, so I grew up in a lot of these different traditions, very influenced by evangelicalism, understand exactly the four spiritual laws, the prayer, all these kinds of different ways of understanding. And one of the things that really caused me to find a home in the Mennonite church is this idea that it's not just about what do you believe in your head and pray, and if you do that here in the right way and use the right words, that when you die you get to spend eternity somewhere else, with a big gap in between those two things. And what I like about Mennonites is that no, actually what Jesus was calling people is to living in a particular way of life as an embodied community that actually bear witness to the world that God's shalom is possible by the way that they live together, right? And so there's an embodied witness that starts now that relates to how we even love our neighbors, our enemies. There's a way that we live in the world. It's not one or the other. It's both and, right? And so how do we get there? And as we live John Byler used to say this all the time, that the way of Jesus is a socially beneficial way of life. So even if we live out our calling the way Jesus called us to, and we do this well in the world, that will actually benefit others around us in ways that maybe they never come to church. But how do we proclaim the gospel, right? And this notion too, though, that at least if you understand, like, how does God transform the world? Like central in the Gospels, get back to what you're saying, in the Gospels, the way that the world is transformed ultimately is through an embodied community of people that lives out a particular way relative to his teaching and continues to grow and expand. And so it's the leaven in the loaf, right? Starts out very small, but over time it pervades the whole. It's the small seed that's planted in the ground that is minuscule to begin with, but eventually becomes such a large shrub that even the ravens find rest in its nest, right? The church is that, at least to me, is that leaven, and is that small seed. And so what's really important is the more we embody a particular way of life and invite others into it, welcome others into the space, and they live out this different way of life, and the bigger that group gets, the less of the other stuff we have to contend with in the world, right? And so eventually, like Jesus said, it will supplant the whole. That's a different topic, but yeah. And the way they did it in Luke 10, right? Kurt, go back to your question, right? We're going to gather them out. We're going to send them 2 by 2. This is what I'm telling you to do. These are your instructions. They go out, they do the thing, they engage the people, they figure out what's happening. They have an experience there. And then what do? They come back and say, Jesus, this is what happened. And some people wouldn't listen. Some people are casting out demons in your name, but we didn't know who they were. There's all this kind of reporting back, and then he gives them kind of some evaluation. So I do think like Luke 10 is a good way. Whenever Jesus is sending his disciples out to do mission or ministry in the world, and then they come back, it's kind of this action reflection model that's based in, what do we know? Like, what do we need to know, and what can we do about it, and those kinds of things. So yeah. What else? Any other questions related to Mennonite Church USA as a whole? I can assume that the importance of what happens in Mennonite Church USA and broader Mennonite institutions is muted in Hopedale like it was in Metamora, especially relative to Elkhart and Elkhart County, where this is what everybody seems to talk about because everybody works in these institutions. But yeah.
Well, I just remember hearing Hubert Schwarzentrooper years ago saying that Jesus is in the world. It's our job is to make Jesus more visible. And that I remember. And I guess I was inspired by your saying, listening. I mean, we in our congregation are in different parts of our society. Yeah, I'm sitting beside Don, who's been on the board of the health center. And like Mary Springer, she's on the board of the school district. So maybe we should just have them come to a meeting and just tell us what they see, and different ones of the people. We have the health department represented here. Maybe we just need to do a little bit more listening as to what is happening in our world or in our community.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes we don't think about that as an essential first step of church leadership or church decision making, right? We somewhat is like these two kingdoms kind of theology. I go to church and I'm in this community, this is my church community, then outside of this I'm in the world and I'm engaging in professional. And because our history as Anabaptists, our DNA is to be kind of a closed community, right? Going back to being the silent in the land, back to Switzerland and Germany during the 16th century where we're persecuted. There became this structure of, or even Russian immigrants, things like this, where the world seems very threatening, right? And the world doesn't believe in nonviolence. They don't believe in pacifism. They don't really know much about Jesus. So we can create this fear about engaging folks. And then we talk about, well, what do we do in the church? And then a lot of church growth stuff in the 80s was focused on, well, how do I get people out there to come in here? And then it was like, well, you change your music and you get a fog machine and you get a slick back pastor that speaks really well and that kind of stuff, and you can attract people with great children's ministries and all this kind of stuff. You get this, and that's how you do it. And it's like, well, no, because people understand that show a bit, and that's not how you actually do it. So what missional theology does, it actually helps us to think more outside of ourselves as a part of our vocation of who we are as a community, right? And so when you start to think about that, it's like, so like at Metamora, I keep bringing that up because that's my only relevant experience to this location. But it's like, so how do we know if we're doing good youth ministry? Right? So we could say, like, we had a youth group meeting on Wednesday night and 8 kids showed up. And the average for the last year was 4 kids. And now we have 8, so we're doing twice as good as we did last year. The next year, like, we could just focus on that number. How many kids are in Sunday school? The other way to do it is to say, gosh, one of the most well-respected pediatricians in this community is a guy that's a Mennonite church who brings those values to bear in his work. We have 5th grade teachers, kindergarten teachers. We have high school guidance counselors, part of our church. They're all influencing people in their spheres. And so if you begin to think about where people are having influence outside of the church, you can actually shifts the way you understand where impact is even possible, right? As a youth minister, I was always jealous of my dad and my brother, who were both high school teachers and coaches that had better relationships with kids because of that, especially the coaching piece, than I ever had seeing kids once a week, twice a week, right? So and so that doesn't mean, I'm not really saying that you go into those spaces to proselytize and make converts, but you bring your whole self, including your faith, into those spaces, which motivate you to live in a particular way, which people will notice. If it's pegged to what Jesus did, they'll notice that, and you'll have influence in that space. And it was because of those kind of relationships that when the church I grew up in split, my mom and dad said, well, maybe we could go. We know some Mennonites because we work with them. There's some in the school. Ron's there, Betty's there, Betty Beckmeyer, some of these people. And that's what made them welcome in that space, right? Because they had engaged folks and found them to be credible, kind, Christian people, right? So they never once thought, well, we're not Mennonites, so we can't go there. It's like, no, these people we know. Then they weren't. Right? But so there's opportunities there to bridge those two worlds, right? It's when we think they're separate and one doesn't have anything to do with the other that we miss this kind of this gold mine of information and relationships and potential, right? At the end of the day, we want God's shalom to be real in the world. That's what we want the world to be as God intended it in the beginning. That's what we pray is already happening in and through Jesus, right? So how do we participate in that? I don't know. Some thoughts. And it's 10:40, no, is that right? 10:15. So it's 10:15, so I think we're at the end of Sunday school. I'm obviously preaching, but I'm here, and then we'll stay for lunch with y'all too. So if you have any questions or want to engage in further conversation, if you have questions about Mennonite Church USA too, if you read Anabaptist World and want to know what we're doing these days, just let me know, and I'll do my best. So, thank you.